Hey everyone, my name is Francisco, this is Latin Entertainment, and welcome to Conversamos. Today's episode is on U.S. assimilation and Nuestra Gente. From culture, economic status, and personal and communal pursuit, how does the Latin American diaspora navigate living in the United States? And does the pursuit of assimilation justify the means? We hope you enjoy this episode of Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.
For our first question, in your list of identities, if so, how do you identify with Latinidad, Latin America, and the United States?
I was born in Brooklyn to a single Puerto Rican mother who was 16 years old. All I knew was Puerto Rico. All that was around me were Puerto Ricans. And at the time I was being raised, it was frowned upon to speak Spanish. So we were groomed to speak English. So, you know, my heart and soul is Puerto Rico, is Puerto Rican. And then a funny thing happened is I grew up. I used to travel from Brooklyn to Puerto Rico, Brooklyn to Puerto Rico, Brooklyn to Puerto Rico, and that's it. And then in my mid-20s, I started to get exposure to different states, to different Latin American countries, and then went to Italy, and it changed my whole landscape. But that's a little bit about me and what I identify in. I'm born and bred Puerto Rican, and I'm a U.S. citizen.
So my list of identities, I don't know, I guess Latina / Latinx has always, I don't know, it's an umbrella term, so I don't know how I feel about that specifically, but I guess I identify as Chicana or Chicanx. So I guess growing up, no, it was really weird for me because as growing up, both my parents were born in Mexico. So I remember the word like Chicano and like Chicana was really looked down upon, like, because my parents came from Mexico and they were like hardworking, and it's like a thing from like Mexican-born Mexicans to not like American-born individuals because like they don't work as hard and all this stuff. And I remember my mother always telling me that, but then in my mind I was like, Ma, like that's me. Like I was born, I was born here. Like I'm those like Chicanos or Chicanas. So I was never comfortable with the term until I came to college, and I really started to explore more of that, and I guess found other people that were like that. I grew up in Sealy, Texas, which is a really small rural town. It's very conservative. It's actually, if you ever heard of like Trump Cafe or Trump Burger, they were like they made national news. They were like these restaurants that opened in support of Donald Trump, and that's like 10 miles away from my house where I grew up. So there's that. It's something that I've come to be comfortable with as like since I entered college.
Thank you. And Daniel?
Yeah, so I am a first-generation American. Both my parents were born in Colombia and immigrated here in the 90s, in the early 90s. I've always identified myself as Latino. Growing up in Queens, I was definitely surrounded by a lot of very diverse people, especially Latino people. Having moved to North Carolina after, during my later years, I began to identify myself, in addition to being Latino, which I've never lost, I began to feel the sentiment of what it's like to be an American. I very much feel like I identify myself as both Latino, Colombian, I guess, but American as well. And I feel like I've genuinely never struggled to understand where I identify. I feel like I've always freely chosen both being Latino and also being an American.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alba Isabella Mar. I am Afro-Indigenous Manaba. I'm Manabi, that is present-day Ecuador. And so Latinidad is interesting. Latinidad is interesting because in my household, first and foremost, we are indigenous people that mixed with African. And so we had religion that was very, very different. And so I didn't notice a difference about, like, I didn't even understand Latinidad, of course, when I was very, very young. But when I was little, we moved to Florida in 1990. And in Florida, it was a very white community. And so I think that was the first time that I was away from people that looked like me. I was born in Brooklyn. I have an older sister. My parents were born out in Ecuador. And so moving to Florida was something where I saw like a vast difference in culture. And then my parents decided to put us in Catholic school because all the schools were bad in the area. And so Catholicism was like the very first like really big difference that I noticed about American culture. Because I was raised understanding that we were American, right? Like that's just the newest word for the continent, which we call Abya Yala. And so Christianity was something that was like a really big divide in our household. Like we knew that school had to be like that, but like at home, that wasn't our practice or our culture or traditions. And so religion was one of the really big things that we noticed about like American culture. And then everything else, right? Like food, language, everything came really, really quickly after that. And
how have you been introduced to U.S. assimilation?
Well, again, I was born and raised in Brooklyn to a single mom who was 16 years old, and we were poor. And my first assimilation, which happened to be in the U.S., was I lived with a bunch of families every year and a half. We rotated just for survival. But my first assimilation, I'll never forget it because I thought everybody was equal. And it was my aunt's husband, who's my uncle-in-law. And I was playing with two of his kids. And he came home and he said, "You guys, I told you you're not supposed to be playing with that." And he said, "You don't live here. You're not my kid. You don't have the same rights that my kids have in my house." So he went and pulled out a bag of rice, poured it on the floor, and made me kneel on it for an hour. So I was assimilated at the age of 8 to learn that even in a Puerto Rican home that's supposed to be family, you're still assimilating to the environment you're in at that particular moment in time. And that's my first sample to assimilation, if that works.
Yeah, thank you, Ben and Vic, on your first how you introduced to U.S. assimilation.
So I grew up in a really rural area, and my parents, like, we were pretty poor. My parents are both technicians at like a factory, and one of my first, I guess, were the times that I realized that I kind of had to fit in, I don't know, or like just to get an education. I was probably like, I think it was like first grade, but I don't know, there were so many things, but this is the thing that just came to mind. There was like some kind of award ceremony at my school. There weren't a lot of, like, I guess, Latinx kids at all, and there was like this one ESL class, and I would get put into this class every year, but I spoke perfect English. I learned both at the same time. And I remember, so there was an award ceremony, and like for children, they have like perfect attendance awards or whatever. And I was supposed to get one that day. My mom couldn't speak English, so she came in and she sat in the cafeteria where they said it was going to be, where I told her. And then later they put a sign up, no, sorry. And then they put a sign up and they moved it to one of the classrooms. And I remember, I was telling my teacher, I was like, well, my mom's not here. Like, it's okay, we put a sign. And I was like, no, she can't read English. And there's like, no, yeah, she'll find it. And then eventually my dad showed up. My dad can speak perfect English. And then he showed up later, but I had already gone. Like, they'd already called people up. And I remember it was at the end, and both my dad read the sign, he got my mom, and they both came. And then I remember, like, I cried, and I went up to him, and I was like, I told them that y'all were in the living room, or not in the living room, in the cafeteria. And then I was like, I told them. And then my teacher was like, well, she never said anything. And then I remember hearing my teachers talk after. It was like shortly after this happened. I ended up going home with my parents early, but I remember them saying, like, she was like, there's no way that I thought that lady was her mom. Like, my teachers were talking among themselves. There was like, I didn't think that lady was her mom. She was like, I thought she was adopted. Like, she's too smart to be able to have like a wetback as her mom. And I remember, like, as a kid, like, I didn't know what that meant, and I'd never heard that kind of language, but just the way it was said Like, I knew it was wrong. And, like, on top of that, every year I'd get put in an ESL class. But my mom's name was Zenobia, and my dad's name was Serafin. So I think it was just because my parents had such Mexican names. Like, I have not heard of more. Like, Zenobia and Serafin. Like, every year I was, like, put into these classes, and I think I realized that, like, because I looked the way I did, I was always going to get treated differently.
Thank you, honestly, Vic. And Daniel?
Yeah, my first taste of U.S. assimilation is probably when my family moved from Queens to North Carolina. I could definitely feel that there was a strong push from my parents to talk a certain way, to dress a certain way, especially to speak a certain way. In the South, it's just a huge cultural change, from Queens back then to North Carolina. Even though we were in a pretty big city, we were in Charlotte. It was still a cultural change, and for me, it wasn't a personal experience, but for me, it was seeing my parents go through the pressures of U.S. assimilation, whether it was language, really. Like both my parents did not grow up speaking English, so it was a push to learn a new language very quickly. That was really my first experience seeing what the effects of U.S. assimilation.
Thank you, Daniel and Alba.
Mine was definitely school. It was definitely school and my parents. It was all the things that are required, right? So not only the language, because language is definitely a thing. The minute I went, I think it was like in first grade when I went to the first, like, it was a predominantly white school. So language was a big thing. We spoke Spanish mostly at home, even though we spoke English as well. We also spoke French growing up. And so I kind of thought all three languages were the same. But then also, like, food was a really big thing. Like, we never had cafeteria food or any, white people food, which, that's what we saw as U.S. culture. We saw it as, like, being stripped of, like, indigeneity and African background. And so the food was another really, really big thing. Like, our main starches were plátano and yuca, and, a rice or something, and school sandwiches or peanut butter and jelly, which I never was allowed to eat as a kid. And so food was another really big thing about culture that was drastically different. And then, so I think school was a big thing, and then having to conform to ways of being, and then only learning about, white European knowledges. That was something my dad always pointed out, my mom. I was the only kid who had my hair. I was like the darkest kid in my school or in my class. So all of it came like within, I would say by like first grade, I started to realize like US equals whiteness, and whiteness is not me at all.
And with our next question, we're going to share our positions on U.S. assimilation. So like, where do you navigate in this, whether it's pro, anti, or a mix of the two? And so why are you in this position? When and how do you apply your position most frequently?
Right. Well, for myself, it's not a trick question, but it's an interesting one because, again, when I was young, I got to live in many homes, and all those homes, they were all people that were in poverty class. So I got to see, the same problems a mom and dad had, either drinking, hanging out too late, drinking beer, smoking weed. The same thing with the kids. The girls wanted to be with the boys wanted to hang out till 3 a.m. I saw so many things that I learned at a young age what I didn't want to be. Since I didn't want to have these problems. I did not want to have these problems. Now I wanted to explore. So I had the fortune to go to Central Park and then see Fifth Avenue and go, wow, there's these nice restaurants and these people with nice clothes that says, hey, I want to be able to go in there and eat. What I need to go do to get there. And I was told, hey, you got to get an education. You got to work hard. You got to save your money. And I've been assimilating ever since because I wanted to be different than what I was exposed to.
I am not sure how I feel about assimilation. I definitely think that there are good parts. I think I was raised very, very traditionally, maybe in a kind of negative way where women are supposed to be a little submissive. And that's the kind of like Mexican culture that I had, not necessarily a lot of the positives. being able to live as an individual in America is nice, but then I also do think there needs to be more of a united collective, because like we are social animals and social creatures. So I don't know. I'm really on the fence about that. I don't think that I would have been able to get out of like my cycle of poverty within my family if it wasn't for being in the U.S. Also, I think my education is slightly different because my parents never pushed me to really study, and I never really did it as a kid. I just like really liked learning. Like I would always I would like do math problems like for fun. I would do my brother and sister's homework because I didn't have anything else to do. Like we were very poor, so like I didn't have anything to do. So I think I'm fortunate because I was able to just do what I liked, which was just learning. And it was something that I picked up on easily, and that ended up taking me to somewhere where I realized so many things about myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with Ben somewhat. I do think that it's a tricky question inherently. I really do think it depends on your personal experience. So I can only speak for myself. I am pretty pro assimilation. I coming from a pretty poor family, growing up with both my parents being undocumented, being pushed to pursue education as being the only route for success in this country, and kind of realizing that was really the only way, in my view and in my parents' view, to succeed and become someone and bring in that wealth, that wealth that I want to provide for my future generations. I do think assimilation is one of the more important factors in that process. I do think that for the Latino community in general, to become successful, whatever success means to you, I think that there has to be a big component of assimilating, especially when it's cultural and especially language. I do think that assimilation kind of breaks down those socioeconomic barriers that holds a lot of people in our community now.
I was also raised by two hardworking, very, very, very poor people. However, both of my parents were very well versed on the dangers and the violence and the denigration that exists in the patriarchy and capitalism. And so we grew up very vastly different. We are not patriarchal. It wasn't my dad that was in charge. There wasn't I'm not going to say there wasn't machismo or toxicity, but we're very, very anti-capitalist. And so for that reason, I do not believe that because a few people work hard and have to work in order to gain some wealth, and others in the system don't work at all and still are on top, because I see those inequities not only with my own life experiences and with my parents' life experiences and all my ancestors' life experiences, but I'm also a PhD student, and all my research also tells us how capitalism not only ruins families and society, but also Pachamama, Mother Earth. And so totally not about assimilation at all, because assimilation equals whiteness. The way people equate success as proximity to whiteness, and the way people assimilate the idea of achievement also as having to assimilate. I think that's what's killing us. I think that's what's leading to the capitalist pandemic. That's what's making COVID even worse, right? Who are the people dying from these huge problems? And so no, I'm absolutely not about assimilation. None of my students are being taught that at all. I'm teaching all of my students the complete opposite, birth through college, all the ages that I teach.
Thank you. And I like how everyone brought up economics into this conversation. And the reason why is because would assimilation be a conversation for those who come in affluence, those who are in part of communities who are in affluent spaces? And so the general question is, how does economics and classism play a role in U.S. assimilation with Latinos?
Well, a funny story from my youth. Again, I was Puerto Rican, and we used to have battles with Dominicans, right? And then in my head, Mexicans were always a step below. And I prefaced that when I was younger, right? And that was in New York, and that's all we knew. And what I've learned throughout life is that most people stay where they were born. So where economics comes into play, again, most people stay in their level, right? They don't move beyond the level. So, I was born in poverty. I got to live in lower middle class, upper middle class, where I happen to be now. And what I've learned is that there's people full of it in all those classes, right? So it isn't class specific. It's the individual inside. It's the corazón. It's your heart. It's your passion. It's your drive that really dictates what it is. It's not related to economics. Now, I'll take a step back. Economics plays a huge role because, like, when you're poor, you're not able to go on these hiking trips. You're not able to go ice skating. You're not able to go skiing. So economics does play a role in it, but it doesn't limit what you can become. And I'm an example of that. And I think everybody in this room is an example of that.
Thank you, Ben. And Vic?
I think that assimilation, or I guess like American assimilation to like people of Caucasian descent, I think that's much more not important, but your likelihood to get out in terms of like wealth and been able to like, I don't know, I don't want to say escape as if where you are, I don't know, like the idea of American success I think is much more dependent on assimilation if you're poor. So I grew up in the country, rural Texas, and we lived in a really, really rundown trailer. Like there was, I remember we had sheet metal on the roof and like legitimately like tires to keep the lamina down. And I remember like always being embarrassed of that. And it's something like, if you don't fit in, you remember that regardless of if people don't know. So like not everybody knew how poor I was, but I felt like everything about me reflected that, right? And then I think that goes a step deeper where since I was so poor and I was also one of the only Mexican kids, it was, I don't know, it was like everything about me was reflective of a certain class. So that was something I struggled with, and there are some lighter skinned Mexican kids that I knew that just like whited out and let those parts of them go. But I don't think just physically I would have ever been able to do that had I tried. And I think my experience is very unique because my parents never pushed me for school, like education. My mother always tried to keep me out of the sun and inside and like put me on diet so I could like marry a white guy because that's the only way I was going to get out. And my dad was very just like do what you want, but like make sure you're your own person. Like, I don't know. It was very mixed.
I really appreciate it. Daniel?
To answer your question, economic mobility in the Latino community is based on many factors. U.S. assimilation, I believe, is a bigger factor. Just because I feel like, especially if you come from family, if you're in poverty or in the lower middle class, I do feel like assimilation opens doors that wouldn't necessarily be open if you had not. For example, if you had gone out of your way to refuse to learn English, which is a language most spoken in America, I do feel like there are many doors that would not be open if you had refused to even learn, or at least try to learn the language. That ties back to my point. I do feel like assimilation is important. However, I do feel like you can both assimilate and also keep your values and your cultural beliefs intact. I still very much am Colombian. I still speak Spanish. I am very much tied to my family in Colombia. So yes, I do think U.S. assimilation and economic mobility in the Latino community are very much correlated in terms of, I feel like the more you try to assimilate, the more opportunities you have to grow.
Thank you, Daniel. And before Alba goes, I just want to share some quick facts. In Standard Business Study for Latino Entrepreneurs Initiative, the business count for Latino businesses in 1992 was 0.9 million. In 2012, looking upwards exponentially, is 3.3 million. And then 75% of firms of Latino firms are located outside of majority Latino communities. 75% of firms who service 50% or more non-Latino clients. and 50% of firms employ 50% or more non-Latino workers. And so what this kind of show, and as well as the current US UDP, like Latino spending, is $1.5 trillion. And within 56 million people, we spend, our buying power is $4.10 billion a day. And so that's our buying power on a daily basis, right? But what this shows is what, all I say is like, there's being a rise in businesses, there's being rise in how much we spend money. However, the sales are still that we sell within each other is still at a bar of $150,000, and that's been from, again, 1992 to 2012. And so the only concept I want to bring up is that as much as money that is being produced is not being invested within our communities. And so, Alba, I just want you to answer this question with that in mind.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for bringing up some data. So some of the data I was going to throw at is the fact that Latinx communities, that self-identified Latinx people, are graduating undergrad bachelor's degrees 10 times more than they were just 10 years ago. And PhDs are more than doubled, and then grad programs. But the thing that's really sad, and this is why we don't believe in the system, why we don't believe in assimilation, it hasn't changed our status. Women particularly, the more degrees that we're getting, the less that we're being paid. And so that's one thing that's like a really, really stark reality for me, who has 3 degrees, and I'm currently unemployed, uninsured, and homeless. And so this capitalist system we see doesn't work. I did the whole American dream. I did everything. I did every grade. I got all the, I did everything I needed to do the right way. And I am currently unemployed. So that's like a huge disservice that this system has created. And so the capitalist system is part of the imperialist project. And so the hegemonic whiteness in this whole system, the more that Latinx is buying into, that we're starting to see that the people who are buying into are the people who are from European heritage. So that's one of the things that's popping out, right? So like we know that the Latinx that are buying into the system, a lot of them do have ties to Christianity, to the whiteness, to their European ancestry. But the rest of us who are African or indigenous ancestry, Afro-Indigena, and my people are both. So we're from both sides. We're resisting really, really hard. And you're seeing more and more of us. And so even though those numbers like our buying power, we really need to focus on that. So I'm glad you brought that up, because we're not investing in each other. The white Latinx especially are investing in corporations, everything that is keeping the hierarchy. So we need more of we need more of everyone else joining community and undoing that in order for us to succeed. Because like it's true what you said, we have the buying power. We're spending on other people, not ourselves.
You can't do things alone. When you try to do things alone, you're going to end up alone. Okay? So assimilation comes in many different forms. You have to go get where you want to get. It ain't going to come to you. And you got to have plan A, you got to have plan B, you got to have plan C. And when you run out of the letters in the alphabet, and then you hit A, B, C, Che, D, because you got to keep it moving. This country is a land of opportunity, but you have to be aggressive. You cannot be passive. You have to be willing to learn. You have to be, and that's what I've done, and again, it's a trait that I got from a young age from my uncle, who I learned I can't even take the same toy that his kids are playing with in his house and made me kneel on rice. So I just got my lesson. I got lesson number 1 from him, and I got my lesson number 2 from Scarface and Al Pacino. But that's my position on the situation. And I've gotten here through help. I've gotten here through keeping my word. I've gotten here by working 5 times harder than the next person, right? And that work ethic hasn't stopped. And I think a big deal, comes down to the end of the day, the person inside of you.
I'd like to talk about North Carolina, because that's where I grew up most of my life. The people that I went to high school with, majority white, that stayed, they didn't do well. The majority of them just don't do well. They're stuck in the same kind of hole that their parents and their grandparents were in and still are. I want to touch on Ben's point. A lot of it is work. Like a lot of it is work ethic, and I'm grateful that I had parents that pushed me to continue my education. You're not going to stop at high school. You're going to push for to go to college and you know, have a career and not be able to worry about, you know, putting food on the table or living paycheck to paycheck like my parents did. I completely agree with that mentality. I lived it personally. Again, having both parents being undocumented in a country that legally didn't want them or didn't want them to succeed, were able to succeed. We're able to buy a small plot of land in North Carolina. We're able to raise me and my sister and provide for themselves, provide for us, and provide for our family in Colombia. I think that's a beautiful example of the kind of opportunity that this country offers, and that doesn't mean that everybody's going to make it. And we have to support our own people in our community. And I agree. And going back to what you said, Francisco, is the dollars that we gain, putting it back into the community, right? Whether it be in housing, whether it be in small business, I actively make sure that some of the stuff that I can get personally, I make sure that it's a Latino or Latina owned business, or where I go get my haircut, some of the clothes that I buy, things like that. So I do think that the American dream is there and very much alive. But of course I you know, there's a lot more work to be done.
The entire idea of the American dream is just like a lie, and I don't think it's necessarily like hard work that gets you there. I think that's just a facade. I don't know, like a lot of my like family is poor, and like my parents were very hardworking, but like at the end of the day, we don't have that much money, you know. And it's like, I came to college on tons of scholarships, and if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have gotten it. And at the end of the day, that was luck, right? It was someone liking what I wrote. So I don't know. I don't necessarily agree. Like, I do think that some people work their asses off and make it, but I think a lot more work their asses off and get nothing to show for it. And I think the idea of the American dream keeps us feeling like we're entitled to more than we are.
Thank you. And Alba?
I think it's interesting because gentrification has created a bigger divide between the bougie rich people and the poor, and it is racial. And so I don't support Latina at all businesses. I support Afro-Indigenous specifically because I'm about reparations. And so that's something that we haven't really brought up with this whole assimilation question, is how does it address social justice and equity issues? And so that's one of the things that we need to consider, or I consider. I'm not going to say everyone has to, but I mean, everyone does have to, is reparations, right? And so that's one of the things that, again, capitalism cannot afford it, because capitalism wants to consolidate power. It does not want to relinquish power in any way, right? We want to keep the rich, right? That's why we have trillionaires. Like, we can't even count that number. Most people don't even comprehend what a trillion means. There is no explanation for that when there are people that are homeless and starving. And can't pay rent because of disease, right? And are unemployed because of disease, or, you know, many different things. And so it's a unified collective effort, I think, to do the unsimulation work, to unlearn assimilation. And it's hard. It's really, really difficult because a lot of Latinas have bought into it. They do see that they have a comfortable lifestyle, right? Even if you're not working, you know, the dream is to work 8 hours a day, rest 8 hours a day, and do what you want 8 hours a day, right? That's the dream. That is what we've been fighting for all of these years. And so people like to work. So, you know, people in the US work more than any other country in the world. We already know that, right? We are overworked and underpaid, but we're happy. Or people profess to be happy in their American dream, right? People profess to be happy with their credit card debt and loan payments. When we know countries all around the world, right? Our neighbors in Cuba and Ecuador, right? College is free. They don't have debt. My sister is an Ecuadorian in Germany who gets unemployment. She gets 1,800 euros a month. She wasn't born in Germany. She's not even a citizen. And we know that reality can exist here. We've seen the future. We know that it works. We know that it can work. But too many people are comfortable. They're comfortable enough, right? They're comfortable enough. They don't care that they're working 50, 60, 70 hours a week, because 80,000 is good enough, right? 60,000 lets you have a house and a car. So it feels good enough, right? It feels just a little bit comfortable enough that we don't want to fight. And so this whole conversation with assimilation is just frustrating, because it's like, we still have a big divide in which people who are buying into the assimilated, right? And people who think that it should be a melting pot. And so the fight the fight is really hard. So the fight is hard for us.
Thank you, Alba. And Ben, would you like to kind of respond to what you've heard thus far? Not just from an individual, because we're all individuals is good, but this is things are happening as collectively within millions of Latinos across the U.S. So kind of speak to the collective.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You know, again, I know where I was born, and I know the majority of the people where I was born, they personally chose to be there, right? And I say that because they didn't want to go with me to the library. They didn't want to go with me to the city to give out flyers.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, on the general side, it's just the same position that I have is you can become what you want to be, but you have to be able to read the land, and the land is constantly changing. So I think the mistake that happens is most people think it's a certain way, and they're not open to that things are a different way. So, you know, I'm Latino, and the one thing I learned about Latinos, and it's almost every nationality, you only hear the bad things from bad people. You don't hear the good things of what the good people are doing. So I'm on a different spectrum. You know, I love this country because there is opportunity, you know, and I pray for everybody, but everything is not for everybody, you know, and you can be what you want to be in this country.
Thank you, Ben. And to our next question, Dan, I'd like for you to start with answering it, and that is, how can either your positions be beneficial for the Latina community?
Again, it's just, but before I answer that, I do feel like we're defining success the wrong way. I think it's all relative. It's not absolute success. It's relative success. What would the position of my parents be in Colombia right now than here, right? Maybe they're not the best off here, but they would be better off. So I think that's the kind of bar that we should be setting, not necessarily comparing ourselves with people that have been here generations and have built that generational wealth. But yeah, again, I think tying back to the topic of generational wealth, which I do feel like is the most important indication of economic mobility for the Latino community, U.S. assimilation when it comes to language and cultural values opens those doors, helps you understand the landscape, helps you understand the corporate environment, helps you understand the educational environment. The middle school and high school my parents went to in Colombia is not close to the same as it is here in the States. And again, we can disagree on values like patriotism and love for country, but incorporating some of those similar values and similar work ethic that America was built on, I do think that's key for the Latino community to kind of step out of the rut and kind of build something for themselves, building that generational wealth.
Just a quick question, Daniel. Is there a difference between a Colombian work ethic from Colombia and your American work ethic?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. I feel like it's more just shifts of, I think it's just more like cultural shifts. I think that again, and I think to what Alba says, Americans work very, very hard, are extremely overworked, but Japanese are much more overworked. Like we see stories about Japanese, people that work in Japan being worked over 80, 90 hours a week and having to sleep in the office. So work ethic can be found everywhere. I think it's the way that it's applied here in the States, and the opportunities that work ethic can provide, I think, are much more different than anywhere else.
Thank you. And Alba, you had a question or comment?
It was a quick comment, just because I don't think that we all are saying the same words the same way. They don't mean the same thing. For example, I did not say work ethic. I meant hard work. Hard work is not having work ethic. Hard work means that you're working very many hours for very little wages, sometimes even unlivable wages. There are more than half of people in this nation are currently unemployed, for example, and those are people that worked 40, 50, up to 75-hour weeks prior to COVID, for example. And so those people, I don't think that those 75 hours proves work ethic. That proves that we have a system which is not a system that was built on work ethic. America, the U.S. of A, was built on slave labor on stolen land. So we can't say that it was built on work ethic or people that worked hard, because everyone remembers that before colonization, this isn't what the land looked like. Right. And that all happened because of free labor. And so that's just a really big disagreement about what the ideas of success or, the ideas of whatever work ethic means. I don't define it at all the way y'all were saying. That's all.
I just want to say something real quick. I was born without my left eye, and I had a glass eye for a few years, and then I wore a patch for the rest of the years. And of course, I got my one-eye Willie, or you're a little punk, or you're the guy from the Goonies. And now, I've grown, just to wear glasses and just cover my eyes. So I've been assimilating since day one. And again, I was casted out from my family and friends because of the way I looked and the way I was born. And then I was outcasted by my Dominican friends because I didn't speak Spanish. Then I was outcast. It was just a long list of outcasting. And it wasn't until the turning point when I says, hey, I don't want to fit into them. I want to fit into me. And that's when my life changed, right? And I stopped worrying about other people, and I worried what I want and what I need to do to get there. So, Alba, I'll just say this. Alba touched many subjects that are probably beyond this meeting. But, it's very sensitive, and we all interpret things differently. And
so, Ben, just to push you a little bit, you as an individual, right, improved yourself to be in a better position where majority of where you're raised in the community that was there, correct? Yes, yes or no?
Yes.
The community that you grew up in is still impoverished, correct? Yes or no?
Yes.
So does this one individual justifies this promise of American dream where one individual can succeed while the collective and majority still hasn't? Does that individual justify that collective?
Well, it goes back to what Daniel said, is how do you define success, right? The people who are still in the hood think they're successful.
Well, we'll actually, all right, so for this case, we're going to define success for making 80K.
Can we define it as thriving? As like thriving?
Thriving. We can define it as thriving. I think because we're thinking about economics, like having a 80K or higher paycheck. But thriving, that works better. But does that justify it?
Well, I'll let someone else answer.
Again, success is success is very subjective. Somebody's definition of success could be, I have a mortgage on a house, and yeah, I have a lot of loans, but I'm still able to pay it off, and I can put gas in my car and not really worry about having to send my kids to college.
So then, just for clarity purposes, and I apologize, I feel like this is on my behalf. It's not just success; it's just economic comfort. And economic comfort comes with, in this capitalist society, comes with a lot of money. And we're going to say that a lot of money is 80K or higher, or 60K. Okay, you find that 70K. Enough to in that case. So having one individual who has that, coming from a low poverty economy, right, so community, is that one individual justifies this American dream of a community of a large majority of people who still don't have that economic status. Daniel, then Alpha.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot. It's not just one, and I understand that one is a relative number, but it's many more. It's many more that I feel like I've cracked the code. And yeah, I 100% agree. It justifies. It completely justifies. And it was my generation before me, individuals in the Latino community before my generation, that taught me the important values that I needed to know to be successful, in your terms, Francisco. So yeah, it very much justifies that one person to teach the rest of us, this is how you break the code. This is how you kind of move up. This is how you push away. And again, it's valuing what you had before. I very much value where I come from, but I don't look in the past. I very much look forward to see what I can accomplish. And I never forget how I got there. It was through hard work, right? It was through cracking that code. And so yeah, I absolutely, it does justify that one person.
Thank you for perspective, Daniel and Vic.
Okay. I don't know. I do not think that justifies it at all. I don't know. You brought up the money threshold, and like, I grew up very, very poor, but I just graduated college. I didn't have a problem getting a job. Now I'm an engineer, and I make more money than both, like I think double of what they made. And I don't know, that doesn't justify anything, because growing up, they work their asses off, and I know a lot of people in low-income communities do. I don't know, like, I can't understand how the success of one can justify the impoverishment of a community. That just seems to me like buying into whiteness and like becoming the oppressor, right? Like, once you receive that status, I don't know, that doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you, Abba. You've been waiting.
I'm just going to throw a little bit more data at you. Right now, Latinx youth, 1 in 10 commit suicide. And for girls, it's about 1 in 7. And so those numbers right there, thinking about our children killing themselves right now, I think that tells us that we're not thriving. I really appreciate everyone's individual stories right now, and it sounds really beautiful, and I'm very happy. I know my family feels like a success story because my parents were both shit poor, and we're, Afro-Indigenous, all this, and, and I'm a PhD student, so yes, that feels fantastic, but we're not thriving as a community. And I will argue with all the data in the world. I've been researching this for the past 10 years. That's what my dissertation topic is about, is how do we thrive? Because if we should define success by money, taking into account also that the U.S. has the most debt of anywhere in the world by like 10, I don't even know how much more debt we have, but I know we have more debt than anyone else in the world. It's interesting to think about the idea of success just being tied to money, because it's everything else. We're dying at faster rates right now at COVID. The Latinx community is being killed more than anyone else. We're incarcerated in this system more than any other. Us and Black people are incarcerated, and Afro-Latinx, of course, and Afro-Indigenous Latinx. We're incarcerated more than we exist. We're only like 13% of the population, but like 30-something% of incarceration. So I don't think we're thriving at all. I think it's really sad, because like I said, the more degrees a woman or non-binary Latinx person gets, the less money they earn statistically, because the world, the US particularly, doesn't value that. So that's crazy. So we're buying into a system that makes us work really, really hard for the American dream. But then because we look the way we do, or because we're, Black or brown, we're not afforded. We have to, like you said, I think it was Ben, you were like, oh, I work 15 times hard. That's amazing. Our president does not work 15 times harder than anyone, and, in Ecuador, we had a PhD, an economist that was a president that did amazing things. The health, we had infant mortality almost dropped. In Cuba, there is like 0 people dying. And they're endangered right now because people don't want to have babies, and people aren't dying. So like the population is super old right now. So Cuba needs immigrants because they live too long. They're like, we need to stop with the people living too long, right? They're doing incredible things. And so it's interesting just thinking about like what thriving means, because I don't think it means success, or it's not the same way that some of y'all are explaining it, at least not the way I think.
Thank you. And Ben?
About it.
Yeah, I look at success the way I look at beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? It is what you want it to be. It is what you think it is. Something that I learned when I was in college, I knew I was poor, and I knew I didn't have a job waiting for me, and I knew I just couldn't rely on my grades. I knew I needed to have a job while I was in school to get experience, because when I'm competing against someone of a different nationality, they can say, okay, you went to school and these are your grades, what else did you do? Right? So I knew I had to get real life experience. And I learned at a young age that degrees help, but it's more of who you know and how you're able to navigate in those worlds. So it's a game, and it's not a given. For example, if you get a degree, like statistics show, the majority of people that study in a degree don't even get a job in their field, right? I knew that. I learned that when I was in junior high school. So I was already alerted to those changes, and that's still the case today. So things really haven't changed too much from the beginning of time. But I measure success by did I improve from my parents? And did my parents improve from their parents? And I can say yes. And I have 3 girls. And I'm trying to put them in a position that they can go to a step further from me. And they're going to define what that step further means. And it's whatever they want it to be. If they achieve their goal, then I've achieved their success, helped them achieve their success because they became what they wanted to be.
With that said, that is all the time that we have. Thank you everyone for joining us. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on all our social media outlets and podcast platforms at Latin_entertainment, and our website where we center the Latin American diaspora on Aveyala at www.latinentertainment.org. Tune in next week for another episode of Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.